Welcome to today's Artificial Intelligence Drones Target Russian Tanks, Ukraine Situation Report 529. We're discussing the latest on the Ukraine war, what has happened at and behind the front, and there we have footage of Ukrainian operations using artificial intelligence drones, which are now appearing more and more frequently at the front. We want to talk about what this means for Ukraine. In addition, we have another attack in Crimea, where another fighter jet has been lost, and once again there have been heavy attacks on Russian industry. All of this, of course, is accompanied by further heavy fighting on the ground, which we want to discuss in detail. With that, I would say let's start the situation report right away.
Military and History with Torsten Heinrich.
With that, we move on to the developments in Ukraine itself. The Russians carried out a large airstrike with 704 missiles. The Ukrainians say they intercepted 615 of them, including an Iskander-M, which is a ballistic missile, as well as 29 Kh-101S. Those are the cruise missiles launched by the heavy Russian bombers. Here we see an example of how the attacks were carried out and roughly the flight paths. That's always very interesting because this way we can see how the Russians actually pre-plan their flight paths. In this way they can achieve a maximum effect, for example, to bypass air defenses. This is always very clear to see in these graphics. The Ukrainians, for their part, have struck back. They hit a chemical plant in Stavropol and they hit the refinery in Voronezh. And here we see the refinery in Samara with smoke hanging over it and fires burning. That's what's been reported. The refinery in Tambov was also hit, as well as the liquefied natural gas infrastructure at Temryuk port in Krasnodar Krai. So that's supposed to be an export port for liquefied natural gas located on the Black Sea, which was hit by the Ukrainians. We move on to developments along the front, and I have no changes to report from Sumy. So let's move straight on to Vovchansk, where there has been another infiltration to the south by the Russian side. We see in Lyman, geolocated at this spot, a Russian soldier who managed to get this far. That's about here on the map, so basically nothing. No dramatic advance, but just another incursion into territory that has so far been firmly held by Ukraine, most likely another infiltration. We covered this in the last situation report, so I won't repeat it today. Like Willy Kiboluk, I can't document any changes. And in Kupiansk we have Ukrainians who are in newly established positions. The Ukrainians have been reporting for some time now that they have started to push the Russians out of Kupiansk again. And now we have another geolocation of Ukrainians in positions further north than before, which would indicate that something is indeed shifting in favor of the Ukrainians within Kupiansk. That's here at this spot. Although Deep State marks this and the other area as contested, we haven't seen Ukrainian presence here for a while. So this could somewhat confirm that Ukraine is carrying out successful local counterattacks here. That's all from the Kupiansk region. We continue towards Beroa, and there we have the Russians in the southern part of Bohuslavka. That's here at this spot. We can clearly see this curve in the road here, which makes it very easy to identify. That's here. Russian soldiers have been spotted at this location, and as you can see, that's quite a bit further south of Bohuslavka. I would assume they came from the east. Recently we also had Russians in Bohuslavka itself, but now there are Ukrainians there again. This is still Ukraine with a Ukrainian presence, but for now Russians were also at this location. That's it from Beroa towards Liman. Another infiltration has been geolocated, and again it shows an incredible, relatively deep penetration. In the source video, Ukrainian special forces defeat Russian soldiers on the ground. And this has been geolocated right here at this spot. On the map it's here, and with that it's about 5 kilometers from the last contested area, and let's say 6 kilometers from the established Russian positions. Another example of how these infiltrations occur. These small squads advance even in bad weather or fog and then secure their positions. And when they are identified, the Ukrainians try to defeat them. In the source video, it was quite interesting to see that the Ukrainians appeared with relatively greater manpower and also sent more professional soldiers. And accordingly, that's how this battle turned out at this point. But here we see an example. Just because we have a geolocation, that doesn't mean we have confirmation of Russian presence and crime. Kapris is a Russian channel, a pro-Russian channel, which, for example, also shows the distance from the positions that have been geolocated so far. But at the same time, it marks that it would have been the Ukrainians who took the position there. Here we see how deep the incursion can be. I keep stressing this point. That means just because we have a geolocation, it doesn't mean the front has shifted, but of course it still shows us a tendency. I can't find anything new about Sivers. The deep state map has adjusted the map a bit so that now it attributes this part here to the Russians. Over the past 6 to 8 weeks, I have repeatedly shown you geolocations in these areas here. So I'm not surprised that the map has now been adjusted. Notably, the deep state map is pro-Ukrainian, yet they're now assigning parts of Siversk to the Russians. According to that, the Russians have entrenched themselves in the multi-story buildings in the eastern part of Siversk, so the battle for Siversk is now fully underway. And the timing? It's unclear how much longer Ukrainians can hold Siversk, especially since the Russians are threatening the supply line from the north and have already entered Pokrovsk, and accordingly supplying Siversk will become increasingly difficult. That's all from this region. We continue towards Kostiantynivka, and here we are nearby. We have Ukrainians operating here on the eastern edge, so they confirm to us that Ukrainians are moving on foot here on the ground. And this is also a geolocation of Ukrainian soldiers. They know that the Russians have been geolocated repeatedly throughout this entire area here. Once again, this is confirmation that the southeastern edge of Kostiantynivka should be considered contested. We can also see this here on the deep state map, where it is also marked as a gray zone. The Ukrainians continue to operate there, and from what we can see, the Russians still have not established themselves there. However, the Ukrainians are still present in one location in the village of Novopavlivka. Here we have geolocated the Ukrainians on the western edge of Novopavlivka. Here too the Russians have recently advanced. The whole thing must have been around here, where the Ukrainians were just seen. So we still see Ukrainian presence in Novopavlivka, even though the Russians keep advancing further in the south. That's all from Kostiantynivka. I can't report any changes toward Dobropilja. Towards Pokrovsk we have a whole series of geolocations again. On the one hand, we have the Russians geolocated again at the northwestern edge of Pokrovsk, right here at this spot. In addition, we have a geolocation north of Pokrovsk. I'll try to show you that on the map. This is one should be here and the other nearby. And this right here clearly shows that the Russians are once again operating north of the city area. They also came from the north, reaching up to this point here. Of course, this is very threatening for the Ukrainians because this way they could be pushed out of Pokrovsk. Interestingly, here we have another geolocation of Ukrainian soldiers who are on site. And here at this spot, we have another geolocation of Ukrainian troops who are still in Pokrovsk. We have discussed this repeatedly, that the Ukrainians continue to have a presence north of the railway line, continue to operate on the ground, and that neither side has enough personnel to fully cover the area. So this doesn't mean there's a solid front line that can't be breached one way or another. Sometimes even without the enemy necessarily noticing it right away. The Russians have also advanced near Mirnograd and have been spotted at new positions. We have geolocated that right here north of Mirnograd and here in the far south of Mirnograd. The Russians have penetrated again. We have this here, that should have been about here and a bit further north from there. So the pressure on the Ukrainians is growing from both directions. Mirnograd is still largely under Ukrainian control, but the connection line to the west is threatened. The Ukrainians say they are still carrying out rotations. It's difficult, but still possible. That is probably true. I'm not the one to say that's wrong, because, as I said, the presence of the Russians on the ground in the area north of northern Pokrovsk, if you will, up to here between Rivain and the area here between, if you will, Rodinsky, Krasny, Liman and northern Pokrovsk. There is a Russian presence, but it's not very strong. There aren't dozens or hundreds of Russian soldiers here, fully armed with anti-tank weapons or anything similar, and in this way, anything moving through here could be caught in crossfire. That's not how you should imagine it. These are individual soldiers who are here and there in a shelter, in a basement, in an abandoned or newly dug position, and that allows them to threaten this position here. But the main threat is likely to come more from the Russians' drones and Russian artillery than from the soldiers operating in the area in between, so I wouldn't rule out that Ukraine could continue to rotate. But for this to work every time without losses is at least a difficult challenge for the Ukrainian side, so that's the situation in Pokrovsk and Minograd. I don't see it getting better. On the contrary, we're slowly seeing the situation continue to get worse. In addition, we have a report from the Ukrainian side that the Russians are now trying to cut off Ukrainian supplies with drones within a 50-kilometer radius around Pokrovsk. So again here as well, the battlefield air interdiction, meaning the disruption of supplies from the air around Pokrovsk, is continuing on the Russian side. And it's still a threat, one that the Ukrainians there are increasingly and more strongly exposed to. Towards Mishova, we've seen the Ukrainians again in Novopavlivka, once more there, here specifically on the eastern edge. So Novopavlivka is definitely contested and not under firm Russian control, as some have already claimed. I wouldn't necessarily want to confirm how accurate the deep state map is here, but we definitely still have a significant Ukrainian presence in Novopavlivka. The Russians certainly haven't taken the settlement at this point. Then we have geolocation towards Huljapol. And there, on the one hand, we have the Ukrainians in Dobropilya. That was recently the Russians here somewhere. And here they showed their flags and thus gave the impression that they had taken the northern part of Dobropilya. However, that was probably an infiltration that encountered few Ukrainian soldiers, because now the Ukrainians are back there and are showing their flag. So Dobropilya is probably back under Ukrainian control. However, southeast of there, the Russians have advanced. We have geolocated these two spots here, which were here and here on the map. The subtitling is roughly here, and the other one should have been around here, maybe a bit further west. All right, we can see the movement of the Russians right here towards the river. What's it called? Haitshul? Towards the Haitshul, the Russian pressure continues. They would be with Dobropilya if they had established themselves on the riverbank there. That would of course be a threat to the Ukrainians if they could translate there more easily. But for the moment, the Ukrainians can keep them at a distance there again. Towards Orikhiv, we have a new geolocation of the Ukrainians from Malatokmachka. The Russians had already reported it as occupied, and now we have the Ukrainians here again, relatively in the southeast. We had discussed this before. A Russian soldier was captured nearby. Apparently, the Russians entered Malatokmachka with armored vehicles from both the west and the east about a month and a half ago, but they suffered heavy losses again, and the fact that they managed to drive all the way there and that a few soldiers got out of the vehicles alive, that doesn't mean they've settled there yet. And we continue to see that there is still a Ukrainian presence in Malatokmachka. How much the Ukrainians still have the village under their control, or have regained it, I can't say at this point. If we take the deep state map as a reference, then the southeasternmost part would be contested. That's what we have in terms of changes on the ground. We also have another recording from Crimea, and you can already see it here. We have attacks again. And this here is a Sukhoi 24, which is, if you will, the predecessor of the Sukhoi 34 that the Russians are using today for dropping glide bombs. And it was attacked here in Crimea. Even though it doesn't look like a direct hit, it's safe to assume that the aircraft is heavily damaged or destroyed. Because they're obviously not designed to withstand near misses either. Aircraft are very fragile when it comes to explosives nearby. So here are more attacks in this direction. If we look at the overall situation, it remains largely unchanged. Juliapol continues to threaten the Ukrainians. For the moment, they are able to stabilize the situation a bit again. For them, the important task will be to hold the line here along the Haitshul River in order to be able to hold Juliapole for a longer time. And on the other hand, of course, to prevent the Russians from rolling up the positions towards the west. As for the north here, there are currently few successful advances by the Russians along this line. Also probably because they are mainly focusing on the Pokrovsk pocket and the direction of attack towards Juliapol. Here, so there's relatively little movement here. Pokrovsk, we must admit the Russians are advancing. At least that's what the geolocation suggests, but technically speaking, Pokrovsk has still not fallen and Myrnograd is likely still mostly under Ukrainian control. But that doesn't change the fact that the outcome of the battle now seems to be only a matter of time, nothing more. The question remains open as to how the fight will end. Kostiantynivka, like other front areas, remains mostly unchanged. As I said, it seems that the Ukrainian statements that they are pushing the Russians back in Kupiansk, that these counterattacks are partially successful. At this point, however, it would still be too early for me to go out on a limb there. That's it for the overall situation. Now let's take a look at further developments. Ukrainians have released videos showing them using artificial intelligence supported drones. We can see that here, at least as far as I know. There are open source systems that work in this way. I'm not sure if they're meant for this case. An expert could answer that. You can clearly see how the drones are approaching here, and I think it's quite visible. It's being clicked, which means the drone recognizes that this is a vehicle. That should mean vehicle or something like that. And then the target tracking begins. And that's obviously a huge advantage. We've talked several times about how electronic warfare isn't targeted at this point in time. It has to emit in all directions because currently there's no effective control to automatically direct electronic warfare precisely. You've seen those drone defense rifles that are held like this. Of course, a small targeted beam can be fired there that hits a drone directly. If it's on a vehicle, it must be all around. It also has to emit in all directions, meaning both a full 360 degrees horizontally and completely upwards. And that naturally reduces the power drastically, which means that the effective range of such a jamming system is often limited to just a few dozen meters. And that's it. The Ukrainians have countered this on the one hand by modifying the firmware so that the drones continue to fly independently in this way, like the last control input before the connection was lost. That means we saw an approach here. If, let's say, the connection is lost at this point and the drone was targeting this vehicle, then it will keep flying and hit this vehicle. But that means if the vehicle moves meanwhile, or the target, which could also be a soldier on the ground, then in this case it gets lost and doesn't hit. But with this support, can the drones continue to track their target? The only thing that might help against this are smoke grenades, which we see being used relatively rarely against drones. That means, at this point in time, as soon as the Ukrainians are able to produce these drones more frequently, they can, to some extent, counter Russian electronic warfare again. And then the drones should continue to remain highly operational. We also need to recognize that the Russians now clearly have an advantage in fiber optic guided drones. However, these are slow and have a limitation in range because they have to carry the heavy cable spool with them. And the Ukrainian free-flying drones don't have that, but they are susceptible to interference. If the Ukrainians can supplement and replace this with software, then they will lose this disadvantage to a large extent and can catch up again. The only thing that might speak against it, of course, is that drones with the corresponding technology are increasingly likely to become more expensive. Of course, that's a development we've been seeing for a while now. The more complicated drones become, the more expensive they get, and the less useful they will be to the same extent. At this point in time, they're being used in large numbers because they're still relatively inexpensive. But we can also see that the development doesn't stop here, it continues. Then we have a recording of a Ukrainian F-16, and it was identified that it is probably carrying the Advanced Precision Kill Weapon System. The Advanced Precision Kill Weapon System. We have it here in a... Okay, here it is. These are originally unguided 70mm Hydra rockets that have been upgraded and are now remotely guided, and they have proven effective in combating slow-moving targets. That's the question we have to keep asking ourselves, and that's the one we keep coming back to. And that's the question that the fighters have, The answer is that it's not about drones. It's not about the drones, by the way, doubting the buzzing drones. But at least in terms of pure weapon effectiveness, this has shifted the balance of power in favor of defensive measures. If these now start appearing more frequently in Ukraine, Ukraine will be strengthened and able to counter the drones. And then it's also reported that new flamingos have been delivered. The Associated Press published this, and we can see that it's actually possible to report about the flamingo without violating secrecy, because we can see here that not only are no faces visible, but the hoods are also pulled up to really make sure that no one can be identified. But also the entire background has been removed. That means we basically have no clue where this is from, where it comes from, or who is working there. I've often criticized at this point when such recordings are made and something unnecessary can be seen in them, because it's simply an unnecessary risk that can be avoided. So here we go now. The report that a new one has been delivered shows they are still being produced, but it also suggests that the delivery is not an everyday event. We remember when the flamingo was introduced for the first time, the Ukrainians had announced Fire Force, saying they would produce 7 of them per day in October. We're obviously still quite a ways off from that, and that's why this delivery is still something special, but of course it's still good news for Ukraine. If they can receive more flamingo, then we have news from the United States, and Marco Rubio acknowledged in an interview, must have been with Sean Hannity, so with American television, that Vladimir Putin is the obstacle to peace, and that's what we want now as well. From our side, do we want to use the meme? No, but oh now. But of course, it's helpful if we have it in writing and on record. The fact that this realization is now being expressed by the American government is good news. And we can also see here that the war is supposed to continue and that the Russians want to keep financing it. According to Kommersant, who have the report, Russia will now also increase taxes on alcohol. That means it continues. Russia keeps working on permanent war funding. Meanwhile, on the Russian side, they are already saying that Odessa and Mykolaiv are Russian cities. That is being brought up again now. That means basically the Russian side is once again laying claim to more territory. That would of course cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea, which would endanger the viability of the Ukrainian economy and further weaken Ukraine in this way. So we see that Russia is still far from accepting a peace that is not a Ukrainian surrender. Accordingly, it is of course important and helpful that there will be further aid for Ukraine from the Ukrainian side. The Pearl Initiative, that's the purchase of United States weapons for Ukraine. Another 500 million United States dollars have been provided by Germany, Norway, Poland, and the Netherlands. So more international support for Ukraine. That's it for the situation report at this point.